Taiwan has huge military strategic importance. It has massive digital manufacturing importance. And then, of course, we have been steadfast allies since 1945. We have made unbending commitments to the Taiwanese people. So let's take those in order. From a digital manufacturing point of view, everyone in the technology world knows that the Taiwanese have by far the most advanced and highest volume chip factories on the planet. So all of the computer chips, microchips that the Taiwanese make, they wind up in everything in America, from military weapons all the way down to refrigerators and microwaves and everything digital in between. The modern digital world cannot exist without those Taiwanese chips. Simple as that. Now, of course, the technology all was invented in America, but because of free trade and differential labor cost and production cost, Taiwan wound up becoming the world's #1 and most valuable chip maker. So just on that issue alone, there is no distance between the Taiwanese people and the American people. When we look at this from the point of view of the military, when we hear the Chinese talking about Taiwan and taking control of Taiwan, which, by the way, they've never had. I can just quickly go through that history. But the Taiwanese actually ruled all of China up until the end, until 1948, basically, when the communists finally took over all of China, and the Taiwanese essentially retreated to Taiwan, and at that particular time, America recognized them as being the legitimate government of all of China. So the Chinese never ever controlled Taiwan for 1 second in recent history. And then before World War II, the Japanese owned Taiwan, which is also very interesting because they owned Taiwan for more than 50 years. And again, China had absolutely nothing to do with it. And the only reason why the Japanese left Taiwan was because they lost World War II. And then the Chinese Revolution and the retreat to Taiwan. Prior to the Japanese ownership of Taiwan, Taiwan was an Asian backwater. I mean, it had fishing villages. It was just a speck of island in the Western Pacific. It's actually quite big. So if you were to take the distance between Washington D.C. and New York City, that is roughly the length of Taiwan. And then if you were to go over from the Atlantic coast, let's call it sort of midway into Pennsylvania. That's sort of the width of Taiwan. So it's quite a big island, but it was a backwater. And it was a backwater for hundreds of years. It was just not paid attention to by anybody. And then prior to that period, Taiwan was owned by the Portuguese, and they were also owned by the Dutch. And they still have Portuguese and Dutch cemeteries in Taipei today. I lived over there for 10 years, more or less. My wife is from Taiwan, so I know the whole history, but that's kind of beside the point. The real issue here is the military point. And the American military front line in the Western Pacific runs from Japan, South Korea, down through Taiwan, all the way down to Australia. We will never lose that front line. We're not going to allow our front lines to be the West Coast of the United States. We have the Navy. We have an incredibly strong naval presence in the Western Pacific. And that does a couple of things. It prevents Chinese aggression. It keeps the shipping lanes open locally. It keeps the peace locally. So from a military point of view, there's no way to give up Taiwan. And when we hear the Chinese talk about retaking Taiwan, what they're really telling us is they want America off their front door. That's the real meaning, because there are no natural resources in Taiwan. There's no land advantage. It's a mountainous country. There are 22 million people that live there. half of them are guys that served in the military because they have national service in the military. So there's nothing for China in Taiwan with the exception of getting rid of America from their front door. So going all the way back to the Eisenhower days, Eisenhower described Taiwan as America's permanent aircraft carrier stationed off the coast of China. So from a military point of view and from a digital economy point of view, we see immediately that Taiwan is going no place in terms of leaving the American orbit. In addition to that, we can note that the Taiwanese instituted the first democratic government in the entire history of China. So now we're going back 4,000 or 5,000 years, and they are the ones that came up with democracy, and it's an American-style democracy, all the way to the smallest of details. So they essentially copy the American system more or less, and it's a real democracy. So those are the main issues that we're dealing with. So it's the chip production, and they manufacture a lot of other stuff too. It's the military issue. It's also, we've got the history on the Taiwanese side, and that's the way the world is constructed. And we talk about this an awful lot, but you see what the Taiwanese do have is they have brain power. So when we look at the society of Taiwan, we have extremely high high school graduation rates. We have, if they don't go to the local colleges and universities for the last 60 years, 70 years, they have fanned out across the planet, and they have acquired knowledge from every country and every university you can imagine. And then they took that knowledge back to Taiwan. And so what they did is, starting right after 1948, they started manufacturing things like T-shirts and socks and garments, very simple types of manufacturing items. And then from that position, they built up to today where they manufacture computers, computer chips, every kind of electronic component and ingredient, if you will, of a particular electronic device. It's all made in Taiwan. In addition to that, they make cars. They have 4 nuclear reactors, for example. They have the capability to make more nuclear reactors. If they wanted to develop nuclear weapons, it would be a very easy thing for them to do. So the simple answer to the question is they went out and acquired the knowledge of the world, took it back to Taiwan, turned themselves into a manufacturing powerhouse at every level of the manufacturing spectrum. And then, of course, today they're right at the top with Japan and Germany and America in terms of advanced manufacturing processes and products. So the Taiwanese, that's how they did it. Natural resources, they don't have oil. They don't dig stuff out of the ground. Like I mentioned, they were villages of fishermen for hundreds of years. So it was a very basic subsistence type of living. But they turned their brain power into their number one resource. Well, those are 2 very good questions. So we know about the Cuban Missile Crisis. Cuba is 90 miles off of Key West. So in the 60s and with Kennedy, the thought was we were not going to allow the Russians to build a nuclear arsenal on Cuba. Now, we need to dig a little bit deeper. Part of what happened in those days was symbolic politics, because in the submarine world, it is very possible for Russians to have stationed 10 dozen submarines off our east coast, 90 miles off the coast, 100 miles off the coast. And in fact, in the Cold War, this was the whole reason behind the airplanes. The folks have probably heard of the P-3s and the S-3s, but there were these very big submarine hunter type of airplanes, and they're based up and down the coast, and they're still used today. and they look like passenger jets, but when you look inside of them, it's nothing but wall-to-wall, front-to-back electronic tracking equipment. And their job is to track any submarines off the coast of the United States. And then the S-3s, my dad was a Navy pilot, and at the end of his career, he was in the S-3s, and they were basically four-seater airplanes, and they tracked, and they were prepared at any moment's time to destroy submarines. So when you look at the Cuban Missile Crisis, there's the idea that, wow, we don't want missiles in Cuba, but from a military point of view, it was really a non-issue because they could very easily set in submarines, which would have been much harder to find. But from a symbolic point of view, nuclear weapons on the land in Cuba was just a little more than people wanted to think about at that particular time. And then we know the result. Kennedy gave them a certain number of days. The Russians took the nuclear missiles out on top of their ship, so it was very easy to see. And that was the end of that, and it became a very important part of history. Now, if we take that situation and we talk about China, of course the Chinese would feel the same way as the Americans did in the 1960s, but that's not the end of the discussion, because we know from all types of publicly available information, the United States has a submarine fleet in the Western Pacific. And every one of those submarines are carrying, 24, 48 or more nuclear missiles. So the end result is, if we're just looking at longitudes, we have got a nuclear force in the Western Pacific, and it's there 24/7. So the Chinese ought to be a little more worried about the submarines and then our missile fleet in Guam, for example, or in Okinawa, or in South Korea, because China doesn't get away from that, let's just call it pressure, that military pressure, regardless of what happens to Taiwan. Now, in the event of a war, Taiwan would really be useful in terms of air bases. We did have air bases in Taiwan before, and as you probably know from looking at my other videos in the campaign, we will formally recognize Taiwan. In fact, we will go to the southwestern part of Taiwan, where my wife comes from. My wife's family owns a little beachside hotel. It's kind of smallish, sort of like a 12-room, 15-room small bed and breakfast type of hotel. It's facing China, but it's an absolute beautiful place. Been there many times, and we're going to hold that ceremony right there, and we are going to write all of the indecision and false turns that we've taken with Taiwan since 1948. And we're going to formally recognize Taiwan, and we're going to propose that we lease one or two of their air bases, because they have air bases on the eastern side of the island, basically on the American side of the island, and we will man those, and we will station military aircraft there, and we will continue to act like brothers for all the reasons that we talked about before. Now, in terms of the rest of the question, in terms of Taiwan's nuclear capability, there are actually several countries that have this capability. I mean, Japan is one, South Korea is one, Taiwan is one. All the Western European nations have the same technological ability. I mean, once the economy develops to a certain point where you've got a brain trust of engineers, of physicists, of people who are educated in the world of nuclear energy. The difference between nuclear energy and a nuclear bomb is a baby step. The issue about taking that baby step is more an issue of do they want to maintain the nuclear force? Do they want to suffer any political fallback? Do they really want to take a chance of increasing a nuclear exchange, for example? So those are more sort of political questions than technological questions. Now, most countries choose not to develop nuclear weapons simply because they look around their neighborhoods and it's like no point. They don't need them. You know, they're not getting any more security out of their military by having nuclear weapons. So specifically in the case of Taiwan, well, we know that if we could pull up a military map, and there are some that are publicly available, that actually shows where America has lots of its Western Pacific military force. Of course, it's constantly moving, but these maps that you'll find on Google and various China and American Western Pacific types of documentaries, you know, they very clearly shows the islands. It shows where we have military assets. And so on the nuclear side, there's really no point in Taiwan developing nuclear weapons because, number one, they can use what's called a porcupine defense to protect its island. And that basically means what's happening in the Ukraine right now, we just kind of ramp that up, you know, 1,000 times. You know, it's very hard to get onto Taiwan if you're trying to land the force because it's a mountainous country. So there are only a few places where the Chinese military could actually land, and but those are well defended. So it's the whole exercise from the Chinese point of view is an exercise of futility, which is why in the case of Lake Pelosi, if we take the current events, the Chinese are always threatening some kind of invasion or military retaliation if America sends an important person to Taiwan. I mean, once you've looked at this issue and you understand it in the detail that we're talking about, it's all comical. You know, I mean, the image that one should have in their mind is one of a monkey in a cage who is upset and twirling around and holding on to the bars and creating a ruckus. But the reality is they're not getting out of the cage. That monkey can't do anything, and it's just all show. And it is a good thing that Nancy Pelosi knows the details of Taiwan like we're talking about here. I mean, she was in Tiananmen Square. She did visit China in 1989 during the Tiananmen Square incident. Incidentally, at the time, I lived in Hong Kong. But we didn't know each other, and we were there for totally different reasons. I was beginning my career, beginning my life, and I just happened to be there when all of the turmoil took place, whereas she purposely went there to insert herself into Tiananmen Square. But the point here is at least she knows the Taiwan Chinese issues in detail like we're talking about. And then, you know, having said all of that, it becomes very easy to understand that Taiwan is America's steadfast friend in the Western Pacific, and therefore, in the Quigley administration, we are going to formalize and make that friendship. We're going to put it on the level that it should have been left at going all the way back to 1948. Well, I think it's an evolution, and I'm glad that the Speaker of the House made that trip. I mean, let's be completely honest here. The Biden administration is a very weak administration. The Chinese gave Hunter Biden, the heroin addict, $11 million. And if anyone thinks that $11 million was for business, well, I got a bridge in New York called the Brooklyn Bridge. I will sell you. I guarantee you I can give you that. I'll do it. But seriously, 10% of that money wound up in Biden's pockets. The Chinese think that they bought Biden with that $11 million. So Biden is an older guy. You know, I think he's 82 at this point in time. He's been in Washington for 40 years. He's probably kind of at that point in his life where, you know, he kind of wishes it would all go away. You know, he's been around the bush so many times. It's become a mental drain on his energies. And then, of course, the Chinese have been pushing like crazy because they think that they have compromised Biden. And it certainly looks like, from Biden's responses, that he is a compromised president. So I think Pelosi, even though they're both Democrats, I think Pelosi, who is in no way compromised by the Chinese in their donations, took the right turn. You know that we need to make sure that the Taiwanese are put in a proper position in the global order and recognized by the rest of the countries on the planet. So when I say evolution, these things often go administration to administration. They go from year to year. many problems in the diplomatic world are not light switches. So, for example, the way I look at Nancy Pelosi and her trip is she's essentially laying the groundwork because by the time we get to the 2024 elections, everyone in America is going to know that we're headed to Taiwan. It's telegraphed. So the way I guess the idea I'm trying to give here is we are telegraphing the future moves of the next president of the United States. And this is kind of a good thing because what it's doing is it's telling the Chinese, well, this is going to happen, so you better start learning to live with the facts. And it's helping the allies in the Western Pacific to adjust their political speech making and their political messaging, as well as adjusting their military structure and so forth, to deal with the future that is coming. So this method of telegraphing future events gives all of our allies and all the parties at this particular table time to make the adjustments that need to be made for that when that day arrives. Well, I wouldn't pay attention to them because the natural instinct of a country like Japan, for example, is passivity. Do everything you can to avoid war. And in the case of South Korea, they have their hands full with the North Korea situation. And the Quigley administration has answers for that problem too. But because they're sort of caught between a rock and a hard space, geographically speaking, then the knee-jerk reaction is just to maintain the status quo, keep the peace. But then when you go further south, for example, when we're in Australia, Australia's got a very different attitude because, Australia's got 17, 18 million people. They have a land mass as big as the United States. And obviously, if you're China, with at this point in time about 1.5 billion people, you need to look for a place to live. You need more land because you're running short of land. So poor old Australia, down there in the southern hemisphere, in the bottom of the world almost, they're kind of alone. So they are America's steadfast partners on this China issue. And they see it the same way that we're talking about today. And that's the right course. So understanding why countries are reacting the way they're reacting is very important. But I can tell you, my wife being Taiwanese, every single day we get a summary. She summarizes all of the news coming out of the Chinese-speaking world. So it's just a coincidence because she likes reading Chinese news and Taiwanese news, but as a result of that, I get to see what's going on the ground, what people are talking about, what the thoughts are. So probably much, much better than most folks across America. And for example, in Japan, Abe, the ex-prime minister that was executed, he was giving a campaign speech for supporters. Well, the news on the ground in the Chinese-speaking world, as well as in the Japanese-speaking world, is the assassin was working for the Chinese. And the reason why Abe, the ex-prime minister of Japan, was assassinated was because he was on board with what I'm saying here to you today, Tyler, and the direction that we're going to take Taiwan. So he was a very steadfast supporter of American policy in the Western Pacific. Now, of course, we are not in the Japanese security services, and we don't have, all the documentation of that particular assassin's background, where he came from, who he was talking to, who his friends were, who his family members were. But at least in the Asian news media, they're coming up with documents and the friendship relationships, and that's what they're talking about in that part of the world. So if you're a Japanese citizen and you're looking at, wow, I can't believe the Chinese are actually, killing people in Japan, especially ex-prime ministers because they support Taiwan, that's a menace. That's a problem. So that rubs both ways, you see. On the one hand, we have the Japanese who really want to be pacifist. They've kind of grown used to a really nice economy without, the clouds of war around them all the time. But on the other hand, you have a very large percentage of the Japanese population that realizes that they've got to have a defense force. They have to stand up to China because China internally has the appetite for expansion, they have the resource need for expansion, and they have an incredibly large population, of which 20% at this moment in time as we make this video are starving, and they have a crashing real estate sector, a crashing production sector. There's a lot going wrong in the Chinese world. And the idea that the China could embark on an expansionist venture with the goal of getting other land masses, other resources, is not in the realm of Hollywood fantasy. It's within the realm of possibility. So the Japanese really, they have to come down on the side of holding the line, a very strong Western ally defense and position in the Western Pacific. So that's how that issue will ultimately fall out. But your question's good. It's a very insightful question. Well, it does a number of things that are really important. So, for example, they get a formal voting seat in the United Nations, and they can participate in every one of the United Nations bodies. Everything from global relief of poverty, the defense of the Ukraine, any issue that the United Nations deals with, Taiwan would have a voting seat and the ability to participate, as much or as little as they wanted to. That's one institution and one benefit. The same applies for the IMF, the World Bank. So they can help finance these human welfare projects around the world. They become full-fledged members of the international community. In addition to that, they will have better trade relationships with all of the countries in the world. So on the one hand, they're going to spend a lot more on their diplomatic corps because they're going to have to send ambassadors to every country on the planet. Now granted, they already have offices in all of the developed countries, and they even have a really nice office here in Washington, D.C., over on Wisconsin Avenue, but they are... or is that Connecticut Avenue? We'll have to double check that.
Embassy Row.
It'll come to me. It'll come to me in a minute. It is no, it's Wisconsin Avenue. It's Wisconsin Avenue. Yeah, and but they don't call it the Taiwanese Embassy. So they always give a different name, which kind of lets people know it's Taiwan, but it's not formally a diplomatic embassy. So they get to participate in all the institutions. They have better trade relationships with all the other countries around the world, like the WTO. They can negotiate tariffs, for example. And in the process, they build more allies. And of course, by the same token, it blunts a bit of the Chinese influence, because the world of China is in no way like the world of the Taiwanese. One is a communist dictatorship, China. The other is a democratically elected governed society, Taiwan. So I often joke with my friends that, really, if we held a constitutional amendment around the country and we had to pick two places on the planet that would be perfect American states, the 51st and the 52nd American state, well, Taiwan would be 51, and perhaps Israel would be 52. Because their whole society, their mindsets, their history, their governmental structures are in line with what America is and what we stand for. So one can say there's a lot of symbolic value by formally recognizing Taiwan. But there's a lot of practical day-to-day value too, in terms of managing the international order, managing trade relationships, and just being a full-fledged member of the world of problem solvers. But when I was in Hong Kong, so I started law school in the British system, and I was in the University of London program, but they also had classes in the University of Hong Kong. So I happened to be in Hong Kong at the time, and I was a typical law student. And I was in the Hong Kong Law School library one day, and I was looking through some of their old law books. And of course I ran across all of the law books from China from the 4 different sectors, because some of the Chinese cities, the capital city, for example, they were divided into 4 sections. So essentially, China, in many respects, were divided between the 4 strongest powers of that day. Now, America was one of those powers. Okay, we actually owned a portion of China in that time period between 1850 and 1900. And we put courts. We put, American common law courts in China. The British put common law courts in China. The Germans put common law courts in China, and so forth. And so I found those law books. And, I remember spending a couple of days just out of curiosity. I pulled them off the shelf and I was reading through them, and it was just kind of a fascinating moment in time that you never hear about, but it's historically a fact. And what were the issues of the day? Why were these cases in court? What were folks fighting over? What were the crimes? America appointed the judges. The president appointed the judges for the American courts in China. So, but that was a different era. This was what was going on at that particular time. And this is when China was still ruled by an emperor, for example. It was the last emperor. And there's a very famous book called The Last Emperor. It was published back in the 80s, 1980s. And it talks about that whole era in informative detail. It's a good read if anyone's interested. But in terms of what's happening in 2022, that's not really impacting anything today, because all those people they're gone. They've all moved on to heaven. So now we have a different group. So what's going on in 2022? Why is there so much friction? Well, herein lies the rub. And we have to go back to the mid-1980s. In the mid-1980s, the Republicans campaigned around the country and convinced America that it was a great idea to engage in international free trade. And the basic thought of that day was, you know what? So much of the rest of the world is poor. We're gonna open up free trade. Everyone's gonna find their specialization in products and services and so forth. And in the process, we're gonna lift the standards of the rest of the world. Well, what really happened was we lowered the standards of America, and we did lift the standards of the rest of the world to a great degree, but America got the short end of that stick. Now we go to the next step. Let's specifically talk about China. The Chinese have always dreamed about being the global superpower. The Chinese in mainland China are a very proud people. They're also very resentful of the West. I'm not a psychiatrist or a psychologist, but when I lived there for 10 years on and off, more or less, often I had the idea that it was the Napoleonic concept. Little guy trying to be this big giant on the international scene, and that kind of summarizes the attitude of the Chinese today in 2022. So what they did with that free trade opportunity is they exploited the heck out of it. They built so many factories and service providers in every industry you can imagine. It was all done on borrowed money, which is why now they're imploding economically. But you just name your product. It doesn't matter what it is. Let's just take something common like knives and forks, or shoes or hats, garments of any kind. Doesn't matter. It can be like computers. It could be cars. It does not matter. Every single product you can imagine. The Chinese government went out and financed and helped Chinese citizens build 15, 20, 25, 30 big production facilities for each type of product you could imagine. And then we're talking about all the private people that built smaller production facilities. So the whole idea from the Chinese point of view was they were going to be the world's workshop. And markets meant way more than profits, because obviously most of those companies never made profits, because what they were chasing was market share. And because the labor was so low, like in the mid-1980s and at the end of the 1980s when I showed up in the Asian world, the Chinese worker was making $600 a month if they were lucky. But in order to get that $600 a month, they were working 6.5 days a week. And the 6 days they were working 10 or 12 hours a day, and then the half a day, they were still putting in a good 6 hours, and they had that little bit of time off. So they were essentially working for pennies on the hour, and that was the model that China used. In their minds, they were thinking they were going to use that mechanism of becoming the world's workshop to basically decimate production in the rest of the world. And we're talking about Western Europe, we're talking about North America, we're talking about Africa, we're talking about Latin America, we're talking about Australia, we're talking about the rest of the world. And that model persisted all the way up until the pandemic, which started in 2020, as everybody knows. So what happened in 2020 was everything had to shut down, starting with Wuhan in China. And at this point in time, dozens and dozens of Chinese cities have shut down, and some of them are still in lockdown. And places like Shanghai have been in and out of lockdown numerous times over this 2.5 year time period. But the key difference is the Chinese government did not have the money to give to anybody during the shutdowns. So essentially, the Chinese government told everybody to go home, stay home. They actually, in some places, they actually put boards over people's windows and doors. They basically sealed them inside their houses so they couldn't get out. They couldn't go shopping for food. They couldn't do anything. They were essentially, literally caged. Millions upon millions and millions of people. This has been going on for 2.5 years. But the government shut the economy down, and they did not give anybody compensatory money to help them through the process, partly because the Chinese government doesn't have the money to give. So now we have an imploding Chinese economy, but on the government and military side, they're still dreaming about being the global superpower. And the thing that stands in their way, of course, is America and its allies. So they naturally see America, Western Europe, the Western Pacific, Australia. We are the enemies of the Chinese people, and America is the backbone of that collection of enemies. So they look at us and they say, as long as America is around, they cannot be the global superpower. So it's this Napoleonic dream that they have, and it doesn't appear to have gone away even as their country becomes economically devastated during the pandemic years. Well, the USA was a driver of that idea in the mid-1980s. And if we want to be very specific about it, it was the Republicans of the mid-1980s that were the main driver. And in this campaign, we're going to talk an awful lot about the mistakes and folly of both Democrats and Republicans. But on this particular topic, at this particular time, we have to give 100% blame to the Republicans of the 1980s. In fact, I remember those debates. I was a college student at the time, but I can remember it like it was yesterday. The Democrats were specifically saying this is a disaster. We are going to lower the U.S. living standard to what we see in the rest of the world. And the Republicans were arguing just the opposite, like, no, we're going to make everybody rich, as America is. And we see what the result is. It did not turn out that way at all. America, in the mid-1980s, American manufacturing was 22% of the economy. American finance was 11% of the economy. Today, in 2022, those numbers are reversed. Manufacturing in the U.S., which is mostly very high-end stuff, like airplanes, ships, military stuff, that is 11% of the U.S. economy, where finance has become 22% of the U.S. economy. So they've actually flipped in this time period. And finance is not so far from Las Vegas and gambling in today's world. So we got to reform that area. But just to answer that question, yeah, it was the whole idea that China was going to make itself the workshop of the world sprung out of the Republican attitudes in the 1980s. So one of those aspects, of course, is China cannot be the global superpower until it removes America from its perch. So this has raised lots of issues. So for example, when we look around America today, we see a massive drug problem. We see hundreds of thousands of drug overdose deaths per year. And you have to sit back and ask oneself, where is all this fentanyl coming from? Where was all the heroin coming from? You know, heroin was grown in Afghanistan for decades. You know, huge quantities of heroin. Fentanyl is something that has to be manufactured. Let me share a little bit of history with our voters. In the Chinese world, there was something called the Opium Wars in the 1800s. The Chinese refused to trade with the British because if we look back in history, in the 1800s, the Brits were the superpower of the world. There were these old sayings that the sun never set on the British Empire. Someplace, somewhere on the planet, was always in the sun because England had so many territories and colonies around the planet. And in the 1800s, the British wanted Chinese tea and they wanted Chinese spices. But the Chinese emperors refused to trade with the Brits because they viewed everybody outside of China as being barbarians, you know, not worthy of their time. History is a different issue. But what the Brits did is they started smuggling heroin into China. So if you Google Chinese opium dens, you will often pull up some of these pictures from the original days of pictures, and you will see, you know, the Chinese with very long, you know, black hair and ponytails and these very long pipes, and they would essentially become heroin addicts, and they would hang out in these heroin dens, and this spread throughout the society. And what it was doing is the Brits were getting Chinese silver, and they were weakening the Chinese economy, and the ultimate result was Britain acquired Hong Kong and what's called the Opium Wars. And so the Chinese to this very day have a very strict view of drugs. That part of history somehow has not washed out of their minds. So if you take the typical American heroin addict, okay, just randomly go to your part of town where drug addicts are hanging out and just randomly pick, you know, some guy or some gal up and frisk them and find out how much drugs they have in their pockets. Well, whatever amount you find, okay, if that happened in the Chinese world, the Chinese would find that possession of that small quantity of heroin enough to execute that person. And execution for drug offenses in China usually take about 6 months. So from arrest to trial to execution, it's usually 6 months, and it's almost never over a period of a year. So the Chinese have an incredibly harsh view of drugs. Now I'm kind of telling you this backstory because that's important to understand where I'm going next. I don't work for the CIA. I've never worked for the CIA or the DEA. You know, I've been a private citizen my whole life, except for the few times I did government internships as a kiddo. But my own life experience and looking at these issues and understanding the difficulty it is to move heroin around the world and to make fentanyl and so forth, and understanding the attitude and history of the Chinese toward America, you know, my own personal belief is if we could dig through all of the supply lines of drugs, I would put $1,000 on the idea that China is behind America's drug problems. Because one of the tenets of Chinese philosophy is if you can't beat your enemy in a full frontal attack, for example, then you beat them from within. So China has been using the workshop formula since the mid-1980s to hollow out American manufacturing. And in my opinion, I believe that they are behind America's massive drug problem because those drugs don't just grow on trees, I mean, in terms of use. I mean, they're coming from someplace, and we can blame it on the South Americans, but, you know, they had to get into the business. Who put them into the business, okay? So my belief is the Chinese have been attacking America on the drug front as well as the manufacturing front to weaken us as much as possible. And then ultimately, if we are not paying attention and we give up our status as a global superpower, which we're never going to do, and the Quigley administration will make sure programs and solutions are in place to prevent everything we're talking about today, then that would open the field for China. And then if the field were open for China, I would literally bet you my right foot that they would become an aggressive expansionist power, because they have to. They've got too much stuff going on inside their country, which is pushing them outwards. Basically, a population that's starving, not enough natural resources, they need more farmland, they need more fresh water, they need more energy. I mean, in order to support those 1.5 billion people, China has to either do what Taiwan did, which was to turn its country into a brain trust, which is, that's 1.5 billion. That's a big project in itself, or to expand out. And the Chinese military and the Chinese leaders, like I said, they're very Napoleonic in their views, and we see this attitude popping up left, right, and center. So there's a lot. So when we look at China, we should not look at China as friends. We need to look at China as very serious, cutthroat, live or die adversaries, and behave accordingly. Now, having said all of that, we have yet another argument in our reason why we have to stand behind Taiwan, because that geographic position, just like Eisenhower said, it's a permanent aircraft carrier stationed 60 miles off of the Chinese East Coast, and that helps keep them in check to a degree. Heroin and opiates generally they chemically change your brain. They're highly addictive, and of course, not every human being on the planet will be susceptible to a heroin addiction, but everybody on the planet, if you start taking heroin today, on the one side of the spectrum, if the highly addictive person who has the right chemistry, let's put it that way, the drug-aligned chemistry in their brains and body, they only need to take it one time, and then all of a sudden they're addicted to it. But then on the other side of the scale, you've got the guy who's got a very healthy body chemistry, who not only psychologically but physically they are way less prone to become a drug addict. Even that strong person, if you give them heroin for a week or two, they too will become addicted. So the opiates in the heroin situation is a question of, if you're a drug dealer, the whole idea is, they're lacing people's joints or pot or other prescription drugs, or all kinds of pills you can buy on the street. I'm not a DEA guy. I'm just kind of speaking generally because I know it's happening. I talk to people in this community, but any kind of drug can be laced with an opiate or fentanyl, and people take it unknowingly. But the whole point of that exercise from a drug dealer's point of view is, if you get somebody addicted to an opiate, then they're going to come back for more and more and more. And it gets so bad. The consequences, the negative consequences, are worth a whole different video in itself. But so that's the answer to the question. Yeah, there's a demand. There might be a demand in the very beginning based upon curiosity, I guess is a simple way to say it. But very, very quickly, that demand goes from being curiosity-based to extremely hard to beat, chemically addictive state. And then you get all the negative consequences. So I would by no means, point the blame on, open-minded, curious, liberal Americans. Of course, most Americans are going to disagree with that statement. They're going to say, well, hey, no one forced them to take it. But the fact is, a lot of them became addicted through prescription drugs. The doctor did write a prescription for a painkiller. And a lot of them were duped into trying it, at some college party or some high school party. And a lot of them were, in fact, foolishly inquisitive. But when you start slicing the issue, it's way more nuanced than just that general idea. They don't amount to a hill of beans. The reality is, when one is the president of the United States we have to go through the issues that we talked about at the beginning of the video and figure out where, in fact, is America's best interest on that issue. And so that's the proper analysis. Now, in the case of Taiwan, it just so happens that my own personal view aligns with what's in the best interest of America. So that's great for the Taiwanese. And on a broader spectrum, we're in an age where we really have to use our resources and our talents and abilities to solve lots of problems on the planet. So one of those, for example, we're going to have to build at least 1,000, if not thousands, of CO2 and methane scrubbers, not only in America, but around the planet. What is a CO2 scrubber? Well, there are 3 of them on the planet right now. One of them is in Iceland, and what it does is they're very large industrial oil processing plant types of factories that simply pull air into their machines, and they suck the CO2 out and they crystallize it and put it underneath the ground. That's the basic idea, because the whole global warming issue is we have to reduce that amount of CO2 and methane in the atmosphere so the Earth can begin to heal itself. So of course, there's a huge energy industry down in the Gulf and in the southern Texas, the Panhandle of Florida, Louisiana, for example. And they're supplying energy across America, but we have to move to a more green energy base, a renewable energy base. Fossil fuels is what puts the CO2 in the atmosphere. The Taiwanese technology can help with that. But on a bigger picture, we still have countries on the planet that do not have fresh water. We even have communities in the United States that have a problem with fresh water. And we all know that you can go a month without eating one piece of food, but you can't go a month without drinking a glass of water. If you don't drink water in about a week, your body will begin to shut down. So fresh water is something that is absolutely critical. So on the bigger picture, I'm just using sort of the general health and welfare of the planet, the energy transitional phase that the planet has to go through. The Taiwanese can benefit in all of those areas. And not only can they benefit with their engineering capabilities and know-how, they want to be participating members on the planet. And you would think, your knee-jerk reaction would be, well, why don't they just go out and do it? Well, believe it or not, you're gonna think this is crazy. But the mainland Chinese government actually goes out of its way and threatens many of the small, impoverished countries that would gladly accept Taiwanese technology and help to solve sort of farming problems, freshwater problems, alternative energy problems. The Chinese will threaten those countries with either military action, economic retaliation, if they help the Taiwanese. So at every turn on the international stage, even in areas that makes no sense at all. I mean, in the American's mind, this is equivalent to giving the guy who's homeless down on the corner $20. I mean, there's nothing but good in that, okay? You're helping this poor guy out, but then you've got some bully that comes along and says, if you give that homeless guy $20, you're not going to kick your butt. I mean, this makes no sense. But this is exactly what the Chinese government has been doing in every situation where the Taiwanese try to make themselves beneficial citizens on the planet. So it's a huge headache, and so we have to formally recognize Taiwan. We'll do it in a very nice ceremony, which is long overdue. I'm not joking about my wife's family's hotel, because it's a beautiful part of the country, and I definitely suggest every American take a trip there if they ever get a chance, because contrary to what we might read in the newspaper, it's a super place for a vacation. Very friendly people.